Rome was an empire built on conquest, marble, and spectacle. But behind the arches of triumph and the burning torches of victory, its emperors carried secrets too dark for daylight. Among them stood Nero, an emperor remembered not for glory, but for madness. He sang while his city burned, staged theatre while his enemies bled, and turned the imperial palace into his private stage. But one act eclipsed even these. When his beloved wife Poppaea Sabina died suddenly, Nero's grief did not soften him. It twisted into obsession. He did not seek another empress. He sought resurrection, and in his hunger to bring her back, he found a boy who resembled her too closely to ignore, a boy who would be mutilated, dressed in silk, and paraded as the shadow of a dead woman. This is not just Rome's history. It is its nightmare. The story begins not with the boy, but with the man who ruled over him. Nero, Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Born into privilege, Nero was crowned at just 17. At first, Rome hoped for a golden age. The young emperor was charming, educated in philosophy and poetry, guided by wise tutors like Seneca. But beneath the marble mask of promise, darker veins pulsed. Nero was no soldier. Unlike his predecessors, he despised the discipline of war. Instead, he adored music, theatre, and art. He saw himself not as Rome's guardian, but as its star performer. To him, the empire was an audience, and he its eternal actor. But emperors could not live on applause alone. Power was fragile. Rivals whispered, senators plotted, and Nero's paranoia sharpened with every passing year. He silenced opposition with executions, exiles, and assassinations. Blood became the ink with which he wrote his reign, yet his cruelty was masked with velvet. Banquets flowed with rivers of wine, golden halls echoed with music and the laughter of courtesans. The emperor's pleasures were insatiable, and so was his desire to bend reality itself to his will. Rome was a city that thrived on spectacle, but Nero was turning the empire into his theatre. He had played the role of poet, of god, of hero. Soon, he would attempt his most disturbing role yet, husband to a wife who was no longer alive, and for that, he would need someone who could be shaped, someone who could be broken, someone who could become her. She was the jewel of the empire. Poppaea Sabina, Rome's mistress of beauty and ambition. Her skin was said to glow like ivory under lamplight, her voice soft as velvet, her presence so commanding that even senators lowered their eyes. But Poppaea was more than a vision. She was a strategist. From the moment she caught Nero's gaze, she knew how to hold it. She whispered counsel in his ear, shaped his tastes, fed his desires. Where others saw a tyrant, she saw clay, and with her touch, she molded him. It was Poppaea who taught Nero how to wield charm as a weapon. It was Poppaea who fanned his taste for luxury, urging him to drape Rome in gold and perfume. And it was Poppaea who convinced him that a throne was not shared, it was possessed. Rivals and wives alike fell away until only she remained at his side. But power in Rome was always edged with danger. For Nero, love was inseparable from possession, and possession often curdled into violence. The end came in a single, brutal moment. Accounts differ. Was it a quarrel or a fit of drunken rage? But all agree on the scene. Poppaea, heavy with child, confronting Nero in the palace. His temper flared, his voice rose, and then, one fatal kick. The sound must have been dull, horrifying in its simplicity. A scream, a collapse, and then silence. Poppaea Sabina, the woman who once held Rome in her palm, lay lifeless on the marble floor, her unborn child with her. For the emperor, grief did not come as tears. It came as madness. He adorned her body with perfumes and jewels, embalmed her in the richest rites, and built her a shrine as though she were a goddess. Yet the echoes of that final scream clung to him. In that silence, Nero's love twisted into obsession. He had killed the only woman who had ever truly mastered him, and his heart, once bound to her warmth, now bound itself to her shadow. The emperor would never let her go, even if it meant remaking her from another body. Grief corrodes the mind like acid. For Nero, the loss of Poppaea was not an ending. It was an open wound that refused to heal. Days in the palace grew heavy with silence. He wandered its marble halls as though chasing an echo, calling for a voice that would never answer. Rome saw him grieving. But his grief was not ordinary. It was theatrical, unhinged. Nero could not simply mourn. He had to possess, to create, to rewrite reality itself. And then he saw him, Sporus, a boy of striking beauty, delicate features that mirrored the lost empress. The resemblance was uncanny, unsettling, like a ghost walking in daylight. To others, he was just a youth, but to Nero, he was Poppaea reborn. What began as glances soon deepened into fixation. Nero followed Sporus with his eyes, studied his every movement. The emperor whispered to confidants that fate itself had returned his love. But behind that obsession lay something darker, a refusal to let death win. Desire twisted into plan. Nero did not want a replacement. He wanted a resurrection. Sporus was to become more than himself. He was to become her. In the empire of excess, power could make fantasy flesh, and Nero, drunk on grief and godlike authority, prepared to do the unthinkable. The boy's resemblance was not enough. His body would have to be changed, his life reshaped, and so, from love and madness, obsession became cruelty. Nero would not just remember Poppaea, he would remake her. There are acts that define the horror of an age. For Rome, it was the day the emperor commanded a child to be broken in body for the sake of memory. Sporus was taken under guard. He was no longer seen as a boy, but as raw material for Nero's obsession. In whispered orders, the emperor demanded the unspeakable: castration, the cutting away of manhood, the silencing of time itself to freeze Sporus in eternal youth. The act was brutal, clinical, and final. Stripped of his innocence, Sporus endured a pain that words could scarcely capture. The body, meant to grow into strength, was mutilated to preserve fragility. The boy's cries may have echoed in chamber walls, but outside, Rome carried on, oblivious to the horror its emperor wrought. And yet, Nero did not see cruelty, he saw creation. In his mind, this was an act of devotion, an offering to the ghost of Poppaea. To him, Sporus was not destroyed, he was perfected. But beneath the gold and silk that would soon clothe him, the truth lingered. A boy had been erased so a fantasy could live. In Rome's streets, rumors began to circulate. Citizens whispered of the emperor's madness, of how grief had twisted into desecration. Even in a city known for decadence, for gladiatorial slaughter and imperial excess, there was unease. Nero had crossed a line that few could name, but all could feel. Sporus, once a child with a future, had been transformed into a shadow. Not man, not woman, but a vessel, a living monument to Nero's grief. And yet, this was only the beginning. The emperor would not keep his creation hidden. He would parade it before the world. Rome loved spectacle. Chariot races, blood-soaked games, golden feasts. The empire lived on theatre, but never had its people seen a spectacle like this. In the heart of the city, Nero prepared a wedding, not a quiet ritual of mourning, but a public display of obsession. Sporus was dressed in bridal robes of shimmering white, veils draped across his face, jewels sparkling like the tears of gods. Every detail was chosen to echo Poppæa's memory. The emperor himself took the role of groom. Before priests, before nobles, before the trembling eyes of the court, Nero placed a ring upon Sporus's finger. He kissed him as a husband kisses a wife, and he proclaimed him, no, her, Poppæa, returned. The court clapped. They smiled. They bowed. But behind the masks of ceremony, whispers ran like wildfire. Senators muttered of madness. Aristocrats smirked behind their goblets. Even in decadent Rome, where excess was expected, this was something new, something grotesque. For Sporus, the humiliation was suffocating, forced into silks, forced into vows, forced into a life that was not his own. He became the emperor's phantom bride. Every gesture of affection was a chain. Every embrace was a reminder that he was no longer himself, only a shadow wearing another's name. Yet Nero revelled in it. He paraded Sporus through the streets as though to prove that even death could not deny him. Citizens watched in stunned silence as their emperor walked with his bride, daring anyone to laugh, daring anyone to deny him. A wedding meant to bind two souls had instead chained one life to another's memory. Rome had witnessed not love, but possession. And in that union of emperor and shadow, the empire itself trembled. Inside the palace, marble glittered, torches burned, and musicians played soft notes to disguise the silence. But behind that opulence, a living ghost walked beside the emperor, draped in silks, painted in powders, adorned with jewels that once belonged to Poppæa. He was no longer allowed to be himself. Every day began not with freedom, but with rehearsal. The way he walked, the tilt of his head, the faint smile Poppæa had once given at banquets. Even the cadence of his speech was shaped by Nero's commands. It was performance without end, a theatre of one actor whose audience was the most dangerous. Man in Rome, at feasts, Sporus was seated at the emperor's side, introduced not as a companion, but as my Poppæa. The court bowed, raising their cups, some with trembling hands, others with concealed smirks. Senators dared not laugh aloud, but their silence dripped with contempt. To Nero, it did not matter. The illusion was all that mattered. He gazed at Sporus not as a boy, not as a victim, but as proof of his power over fate. See, his eyes seemed to say, death itself bends to my will. But for Sporus, the torment was suffocating. He became less a person than a shadow. Every mirror in the palace reflected not his face but hers. Every step reminded him that his body had been stolen, his future erased. He was locked in a role scripted by grief and enforced by fear. In private moments, perhaps he dreamed of escape. Perhaps he stared into the gardens, where the air smelled of roses, and longed for anonymity among the crowds of Rome. But the chains were invisible, woven from fear and spectacle. To resist was to die. To obey was to vanish inside another's skin. Even in ceremonies of state, Sporus appeared as empress, draped in regalia meant for a woman long dead. Rome itself was forced into the delusion, bowing to a lie carved into flesh. Some whispered he was cursed, others that he was pitiful, but none dared act. And so, the boy became a phantom empress. Each smile was borrowed, each gesture rehearsed, each public appearance a reminder that power in the wrong hands can consume even identity itself. To the world, he glittered like a jewel. To himself, he was a prisoner trapped in someone else's reflection. The palace was not home. It was a stage. And Nero's grief, once private, had become Sporus's lifelong cage. When Nero fell, the empire exhaled. The tyrant was gone, and with him, his reign of theatrical cruelty. But for Sporus, freedom never came. The new rulers of Rome saw him not as a victim, but as a prize. He was passed from patron to patron, paraded before generals and senators who mocked him as the empress. His very existence became a living reminder of Nero's madness, an object of ridicule cloaked in silk. Some used him to insult Nero's memory, others to amuse their guests. At banquets, laughter followed his steps. The young boy who had once been mutilated to preserve beauty was now a grotesque ornament in the games of power. Rome had stripped him twice, first of his body, then of his dignity. Even when he tried to live quietly, whispers followed him like shadows. He was never Sporus. He was always her, the false Poppaea, the emperor's phantom bride. And in this cruel theatre, where survival was reduced to spectacle, the boy who had been forced to play a role found no escape, only mockery, only chains without walls. History remembers emperors by their monuments, their conquests, their legacies carved in stone. But Nero's memory is haunted not by triumph, but by a boy's stolen life. The story of Sporus is not simply one of cruelty. It is a mirror held to power itself, a reminder that unchecked authority can warp grief into possession, desire into destruction. Nero did not love Poppaea enough to let her rest. Instead, he sought to conquer even death, and in doing so, he shattered another soul. Sporus became a symbol, not of Rome's grandeur, but of its grotesque hunger for spectacle. He was a ghost, forced to walk in daylight. His every gesture, a reminder of how power can rewrite identity, how one life can be consumed to satisfy another's delusion. And, though centuries have passed, the story lingers. It chills us because it blurs the lines we cling to. Love and obsession, mourning and madness, devotion and domination. Nero believed he could remake the world in his grief. What he truly left was a curse, the curse of a boy condemned to live as the shadow of a dead empress. In the end, Rome moved on. Emperors rose and fell. The empire itself collapsed into ruin. But the tale of Sporus survived, not in marble, not in gold, but in whispers, in histories, in the enduring horror of what power can do when no one dares to stop it. A wedding of shadows, a stolen body, a curse that echoes still, still.